Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Got a story tonight about a man who stood between two worlds and was claimed by neither. A man who put on a badge every morning, knowing full well that both sides of that badge resented him for wearing it. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let me tell you about Jonas Redfern, the half-blood sheriff of Callow Creek. I'm going to tell you about the night Jonas Redfern had to choose between the town that barely tolerated him and the people who shared his blood. It was the kind of night that breaks most men clean in half. But before I get to that night, you need to understand something about Jonas. You need to understand what it cost him just to wake up every morning and put that badge on. Because when you hear what he did at the end, it won't make sense unless you know what he gave up to get there. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let me tell you who Jonas Redfern was. The way the old-timers used to tell it, Jonas Redfern came into this world already caught between two fires. His mother was a Lakota woman named Morning Sparrow. She had come south with her family when the reservation boundaries shifted for the third time in 10 years, and she had found work in the small trading settlement that would eventually grow into Callow Creek. His father was a man named Thomas Redfern, a deputy out of Benton Falls who rode through that settlement one autumn and stayed for the winter because the woman who fed him biscuits at the trading post made them better than any he had ever tasted. Thomas Redfern was not a complicated man. He loved his wife. He loved his son. He wore his badge with quiet honesty, and he died of a fever when Jonas was 4 years old, leaving behind 3 things: a name, a reputation for fairness, and a boy who looked like he belonged to 2 different stories at once. By the time Jonas was old enough to understand what people said when they thought he couldn't hear, he had already learned the landscape of his own life. In the white part of Callow Creek, the main street with its general store and its land office and its 2 saloons, he was the Indian boy, the half-breed, the one folks looked past when they needed something official done, hoping someone else would handle it. In the Lakota camp 3 miles east along the creek bed, where his mother's cousin still lived with the remnants of a family that had been moved twice in a decade, he was something else entirely. He was the son of a lawman, a white man's child who had been given a white man's name and sent to a white man's school. Neither place had a word for what he was. Jonas was 31 years old when the county seat in Harmon sent a letter to Callow Creek asking who was running law enforcement in the area. There was no formal answer because there was no formal law. The previous sheriff had ridden north to find better land 2 seasons earlier and simply hadn't come back. What remained was a town of 300 people and a badge collecting dust on a nail inside the old jail office. The letter from Harmon was specific. They needed someone appointed. They needed it done inside 30 days, or the county would send its own man, a stranger, to run the territory. The town council met in the back room of the general store on a Thursday evening. There were 5 men present, and they argued for 2 hours. Nobody wanted the job. It paid $40 a month and came with the reasonable expectation that somebody would try to shoot you at least twice a year. Every man with a decent life to protect declined before his name was even formally suggested. Jonas heard about the meeting the following morning from Dora Finn, who ran the laundry on the east end of Main Street and who made it her business to know everything that happened in Callow Creek within 12 hours of its happening. He was buying coffee at the trading post when Dora told him. He set his coins on the counter, he picked up his coffee, he walked 3 doors down to the old jail office. He took the badge off the nail. He pinned it to his shirt. Then he went about his day. Nobody challenged it that first morning. In a town that desperately needed someone to wear a badge and had just spent 2 hours proving that nobody with options was going to do it, Jonas Redfern's quiet, unannounced self-appointment had a certain logical momentum that was hard to argue with. By the following week, word had reached the county seat. A letter came back from Harmon confirming his appointment. His name, Jonas Redfern, formerly of no fixed employment, was now the official sheriff of Callow Creek and the surrounding territory. He got 6 congratulations. He counted them, 6 in a town of 300. The rest of the responses could be divided into 2 broad categories. There were the people who said nothing at all and looked slightly past him whenever he spoke. And there were the people who said things directly to his face. Aldous Briggs, who owned the larger of the 2 saloons and had therefore appointed himself an unofficial spokesman for a certain portion of Callow Creek's opinion, was the first of the second category. He said it on the front step of the saloon, loud enough for the street to hear. You really think this town is going to take orders from a half-breed? Jonas turned and looked at the man. Briggs was 52 years old, thick through the chest, and had the particular confidence of someone who had been the loudest voice in the room for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be answered. Jonas said, "The county seat in Harmon thinks so. They sent a letter. I can show you if you like." He did not raise his voice. He did not touch his badge. He turned and walked on. He heard Briggs say something else behind him, shorter, nastier, to the men on the porch. He kept walking. That was the first morning. There were 6 years of mornings after it. The way the old-timers remembered it, Jonas Redfern ran a quiet town. Not a dead town. Callow Creek had its share of trouble, its Saturday night fights, and its disputed water rights, and its occasional stranger passing through with reasons to avoid other places. But Jonas handled each thing as it came, without fanfare, without cruelty, and with a patience that wore down most trouble before it had a chance to become serious. He learned early on that the best tool available to a lawman who nobody quite trusted was absolute consistency. He was the same in every situation. He arrested a white rancher's son for breaking windows on a Thursday and a Lakota trader's nephew for the same offense on a Friday, and he treated both cases identically. He filed the same paperwork. He charged the same fine. He let both men out the following morning with the same instructions and the same even expression. People complained about the consistency, too, but they complained about it differently than they had complained about him in the beginning. In the early days, the complaints were about who he was. Later, they were about specific decisions he had made. That was progress. It was a particular, narrow, grudging kind of progress. But Jonas had learned not to be particular about what kind it was. He lived alone in the small room at the back of the jail office. He cooked simple meals on a cast-iron stove. He owned 4 books, a Bible he read without strong conviction, a geography of the Western Territories, a volume of natural history that had belonged to his father, and a journal he kept in his mother's language, written in the careful syllabary she had taught him when he was 7 years old. He visited the Lakota camp once a week, usually on a Wednesday morning. His mother's cousin, a woman named Runs Clear, still lived there with her 2 grandchildren and an elderly man everyone called Grandfather Cedar, who had been old for as long as anyone could remember. Jonas brought supplies when he had them to spare. He helped with repairs. He sat by their fire and spoke in a language he used nowhere else in his life. In the camp, they called him by his Lakota name, the one his mother had given him. It translated roughly as Stillwater, a name for a person who looks calm on the surface while something stronger moves below. He never told anyone in Callow Creek that name. It was the one thing he kept entirely to himself. In the 6th year of Jonas Redfern's tenure as sheriff of Callow Creek, the territory began to change. It had been changing for longer than that, of course. The land itself carried the memory of changes going back further than anyone alive could reckon. But in that particular year, the change became something that even the people who preferred not to notice things were forced to notice. The railroad was coming. Not to Callow Creek directly. The survey lines had been drawn 50 miles south, following the flattest ground. But the railroad brought with it the people who came before it, the speculators, the agents, the men who bought land cheap before the tracks were laid and sold it expensive after. They arrived in small numbers at first, then in larger groups, asking questions about ownership, about boundaries, about what certain stretches of territory were being used for and by whom. The Lakota camp sat on good land. It was not reservation land. The family group that had settled there existed in that uncertain space between formal territorial acknowledgement and practical tolerance, sustained mostly by the fact that nobody had previously thought the land was worth taking. Their claim was not recorded in any county office. Their presence was known but not formalized. When the land agents arrived, they recognized this immediately. Jonas learned about the first approach to Runs Clear's camp on a Wednesday morning, as he always did, from the Wednesday morning visit itself. He rode the 3 miles east along the creek and found the camp quieter than usual. The children were inside. Grandfather Cedar was sitting at the entrance to his shelter in a way that suggested he had not moved for some time. Runs Clear told him 2 days earlier they had papers. They said the land had been filed under an error in the county records and that the correct owner, a land company from Harmon, had documentation going back 12 years. They had been polite. They had given the camp 3 weeks to move. Jonas sat with this for a long time. He rode back to Callow Creek and went directly to the land office. He asked the clerk, a young man named Ferris, who had only held the position for 8 months, to show him every record associated with the creek property east of town. Ferris showed him what he had. The filing was irregular. Jonas could see it even without legal training. The dates were inconsistent. The signature on the original claim document was witnessed by a man whose name appeared nowhere else in the county records, which was unusual because witnesses to property filings were generally local people whose names appeared frequently. This witness seemed to have existed only for the duration of this one document. Jonas wrote it all down in his careful handwriting. He rode to Harmon the following day. He presented his findings to the county clerk, a slow-moving man named Alderton, who had been in the position long enough to have seen several variations of exactly what Jonas was describing. Alderton looked at the documentation. He looked at Jonas. He said he would need time to review the matter. Jonas asked how much time. Alderton said perhaps 3 weeks. 3 weeks was exactly how much time Runs Clear's family had been given. Jonas rode back to Callow Creek. He sat at his desk in the jail office and thought about the geography of his situation. He was a county-appointed sheriff. His authority extended to law enforcement within his designated territory. What was happening to the camp was, technically, a legal matter. A civil dispute between a land company and a group of occupants without formal title. It was outside his direct jurisdiction. He thought about his father, who had worn a badge in this same territory 27 years earlier. He thought about a man described in the town's memory as fair. He thought about what fair meant when the structures that were supposed to produce fairness were themselves irregular. He also thought about Aldous Briggs, because 3 weeks earlier, Jonas had noticed Briggs having a long conversation outside the saloon with one of the land agents. He had not thought much of it at the time. Briggs talked to everyone. But now, sitting at his desk running the dates backward, he thought about it differently. He thought about it for most of that night. In the morning, he went to see Runs Clear again. He told her what he had found. He told her what he suspected. He did not make promises he was not certain he could keep. But he told her one thing clearly. Nobody moves this camp in 3 weeks, he said. Not while I'm wearing this badge. Runs Clear looked at him for a long time. She said something in Lakota that Grandfather Cedar, from his seat at the entrance, responded to with a sound that might have been agreement. Jonas asked what she had said. She told him, "Still water moves when it must, not before." He rode back to Callow Creek. The land agents paid a visit to the jail office that same afternoon. There were 2 of them, and they were exactly the kind of men Jonas had dealt with many times in 6 years of wearing a badge. Well-dressed, practiced in the language of paperwork and procedure, accustomed to being accommodated. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Harmon Land Consortium. They said they understood the sheriff had been making inquiries at the county office. Jonas confirmed this. They said they hoped there wouldn't be any misunderstanding about the nature of the situation. The filing was entirely in order. They had documentation. Jonas said he had documentation, too. There was a pause in the conversation that had the quality of 2 men realizing they were not talking to someone who would be easily managed. The older of the 2 agents, a thin man with careful eyes and a coat that had been expensive when it was new, said that he hoped Sheriff Redfern understood the broader picture. The territory was changing. Development was coming. That was good for everyone, Jonas said. It's good for some people. The agent said that accommodating the natural progress of settlement was part of a lawman's responsibility. Jonas said, "My responsibility is to the law as it's written. When I find something that doesn't match the law as it's written, I report it. That's what I did. That's what I'll keep doing." He did not ask them to leave. He did not threaten them. He simply continued looking at them with the same even patience he had applied to every difficult conversation in 6 years, until they ran out of things to say and left. After they were gone, he opened his journal. He wrote the date. He wrote both men's names, which he had noted carefully. He wrote down everything they had said. Then he went back to work. The confrontation with Aldous Briggs came on a Friday, which meant the saloon was full. Jonas had known for some time that Briggs was involved in the land situation. He had traced the web of small connections. The conversation outside the saloon, a business trip Briggs had taken to Harmon 6 months earlier that aligned with certain filing dates. The fact that Briggs's name appeared as a local reference on a document the land agents had submitted. These were not proof of wrongdoing. They were connections, and connections were not the same thing as guilt. Jonas had been careful about that distinction for 6 years, but on that Friday afternoon, a woman named Edna Marsh came to the jail office. Edna was 63 years old and had lived in Callow Creek her entire life. She had a small farm 2 miles north of town, a farm that had been in her family for 22 years. She had received a notice that morning informing her that her land had been identified as part of the same filing irregularity affecting other properties in the region. Her hands were shaking when she showed Jonas the paper. He read it carefully. He read it again. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Her farm was being claimed under the same process being applied to the camp, the same land company, the same documentation errors or alleged lack thereof. He asked Edna how long she had the paper. Since 7 in the morning, she said. She had been too frightened to come to him until now. Jonas thanked her. He told her to go home. He told her not to speak to anyone from the land company without him present. Then he put on his hat and walked to the saloon. Briggs was behind the bar. The Friday crowd was settled in. Ranchers and workers and drifters, and the usual assortment of men who found the end of a working week best processed with something in a glass. Jonas walked to the far end of the bar, away from most of the crowd, and stood until Briggs came to him. "Sheriff," Briggs said. The word had a quality to it that it never quite lost in 6 years. A slight emphasis, a small invisible set of quotation marks around it. Jonas set Edna Marsh's paper on the bar. Briggs looked at it. "You want to tell me how your name ended up as a local reference on a land consortium filing that's now threatening 20-year farms?" Jonas asked. Briggs said it was a business matter. He said Jonas wouldn't understand the complexities of land development. Jonas said he understood that Edna Marsh had been in her house since before Briggs arrived in Callow Creek. He said he understood that the filing dates on the consortium's documents did not match the dates in the county records he had personally reviewed. Briggs leaned on the bar. He lowered his voice, though the quality of it didn't change. "You know your problem, Redfern. You don't understand where you stand. This town tolerated you because there was nobody better available. But this territory is going to grow, and when it grows, there won't be room for a man who can't decide which side he's on." Jonas looked at him for a moment. "I know exactly which side I'm on," he said. "I'm on the side of the law. I've been there for 6 years. You've known that all along." He picked up the paper. He walked out. Behind him, the saloon was quiet for the count of 3. Then the noise resumed, because that was what saloons did. Jonas walked back to the jail office and sat at his desk. He picked up his pen. He thought about what Briggs had said. He thought about it not with anger, but with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. Can't decide which side he's on. He had been hearing some version of that sentence his entire life. It came from different directions and wore different language, but the meaning was always the same. The assumption was that a man whose blood contained 2 histories was somehow incomplete, that he was waiting to resolve himself into one thing or the other, that the choosing was the point. Jonas had decided around the age of 14 that this was exactly wrong. He was not half of 2 things. He was whole of one thing, a thing that the people doing the labeling didn't have a word for yet because they had spent most of their energy building walls instead of looking at what lived between them. He was Stillwater. He was Jonas Redfern. He was the sheriff of Callow Creek. He wrote a letter to the county clerk in Harmon. He outlined the irregularities in the land consortium's filings in precise, methodical detail. He cited the specific documents, the specific dates, the specific inconsistencies. He listed the names of the people affected. He listed Briggs's name as a local reference on the consortium's filing. He requested that the county suspend any action on the filings pending formal review. He signed his name. He sealed the letter. He set it by the door for the morning rider. Then he went to sleep. The Wednesday visit, 2 weeks later, was different. Jonas rode the 3 miles east along the creek with the particular awareness that had been accompanying him since the land agent's visit. He was watching the trail more carefully. He was noting the quality of the light, the sound of the creek, whether any of the markers along the path had been disturbed. He found the camp intact, but he found it tense in a way that Runs Clear did not try to conceal. 2 things had happened in the preceding days. The first was that the land agents had returned, this time with a man Jonas did not recognize, a large man with a deputy marshal's badge from Harmon who had informed Runs Clear that the county's review of the filing would take longer than anticipated. He had suggested, in the careful language of someone who has been instructed to be careful, that the camp would be wise to begin making arrangements. The second thing was that someone had cut the fence line on the east side of the camp's small grazing area. The 2 horses had wandered before being found. The cut was clean. It was not an accident. Jonas sat with Grandfather Cedar while Runs Clear made tea. The old man said very little. He had the quality of someone who had lived through enough changes that he was not surprised by new ones, but who understood the weight of each one clearly. He said, in Lakota, that Stillwater was being tested. Jonas asked what he meant. Grandfather Cedar said that there was a kind of test that looks like a problem with land or law or money. But the real test is what a man chooses when the choosing costs him everything he has built. Jonas said he wasn't sure what he had built. The old man looked at him with a patience that made 6 years of badge-wearing seem like an afternoon. You built something harder, he said, a place where the law is the same for everyone. That is not nothing, that is everything. Now, if you're still awake and this fire is keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming, one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were. Jonas rode back to town slower than usual. He was thinking about what Grandfather Cedar had said. He was thinking about the fence line and the clean cut and the specific message that sent. He was thinking about the letter he had sent to Harmon 2 weeks earlier and the silence that had come back in response. He was also thinking about a rider he had seen on the Eastern Trail, a man he did not recognize, sitting a horse in the shadow of a cedar grove, watching him pass. The man had not moved. He had not made any threatening gesture. He had simply watched. Jonas had noted the horse's markings, the man's coat, the direction he was facing. Back at the jail office, he added these details to his journal. Then he went looking for someone he had not spoken to in 6 years. Frank Alderton, the county clerk who had seen variations of Jonas's documentation problem before, had a brother in Callow Creek. The brother ran the feed store on the west end of Main Street. He was a quiet man named Clem who had no opinion about Jonas in either direction, which in Callow Creek made him practically singular. Jonas found Clem in the back of the feed store counting sacks. He asked Clem, directly and without preamble, whether his brother in Harmon had mentioned anything about the land filing review. Clem stopped counting. He set down his notebook. He looked at Jonas with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man being asked to carry information between two people who were in conflict. The night it came to a head was 3 days later, on a Tuesday. Jonas had spent those 3 days preparing. He had ridden to 3 different farms and talked to 3 different families. He had drafted a formal protest document, not a letter, but an official legal objection, citing chapter and verse of the territorial statutes that governed land filings and the specific procedural requirements for witness verification. He had made 2 copies. He had sent one to a lawyer in Benton Falls whose name he had gotten from his father's old correspondence, a man named Carver who had a reputation for taking cases that nobody else would touch. He had done all of this quietly, without announcement, in the way he did everything. On Tuesday evening, just after dark, he heard horses on the Eastern Trail. He was on the porch of the jail office. He sat very still, the way he always sat when he was listening. 3 horses, moving at a steady pace, not hurrying. Coming from the direction of the creek, he thought about the cut fence. He thought about the man in the cedar grove. He thought about the 3 weeks that had now elapsed, and the county approval that was coming, and the particular logic of men who believed that a legal process was proceeding in their favor, and who therefore felt comfortable accelerating other processes. He went inside, he picked up his rifle, he walked east. The night was clear, the kind of clear that happens in the high desert when the air has been scrubbed by recent wind. Stars were vivid and close. The creek was audible from some distance, a low, steady sound that had been the background noise of the camp for as long as anyone there could remember. Jonas heard the horses stop before he reached the camp. He slowed. He moved off the trail into the brush and came around from the north the way his mother had taught him to approach a place when he wasn't certain what he was approaching. He saw the 3 riders in the clearing at the edge of the camp. He did not recognize all of them, but he recognized the one in the center. It was the large man with the deputy marshal's badge from Harmon. He was speaking to Runs Clear, who had come out of her shelter and was standing with her arms at her sides in the way she stood when she had decided not to move. The man was saying, in the patient, final voice of someone delivering an ultimatum, that the paperwork had been approved, that the property was no longer theirs to occupy, that he was here to provide official notice that they had until the following morning. Runs Clear said nothing. The 2 men flanking the deputy were not official. Jonas could see that from the quality of their presence, the way they sat their horses, the particular alertness of men who were there to make a point rather than execute a legal process. One of them had a torch. It was not lit, but it was in his hand. Jonas stepped out of the brush. He said, "Evening." The 3 men turned. The deputy marshal's expression went through several changes in quick succession. Jonas said, "I'm Sheriff Redfern, Callow Creek. I'll need to see your documentation." The deputy said he had already presented his documentation to the occupants. Jonas said, "I'm not an occupant. I'm the law. Show me the documentation." There was a silence. The man with the torch shifted his weight. Jonas said, without looking away from the deputy, "If that torch gets lit before I've reviewed the official documentation, I'll arrest every person in this clearing for attempted arson of occupied property. That's a territorial felony. I suggest you keep it cold." The man held the torch still. The deputy reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. Jonas walked forward and took it. He read it. He read it carefully, because he had learned that careful reading was the most powerful tool available to a man in his position. He found what he was looking for on the third page, the witness signature on the underlying filing document. The same witness whose name appeared nowhere else in the county records. The same signature he had flagged in his letter to Harmon 2 weeks earlier. He said, "This document contains a procedural irregularity that is currently under formal legal review by the Office of the Territorial Attorney in Benton Falls." This was not entirely accurate. He had sent the letter to the lawyer named Carver. He had not yet received confirmation that the matter was under formal review, but it was close enough to accurate that the distinction would take time to resolve, and time was what he needed. The deputy said he was not aware of any pending review. Jonas said, "Then you'll want to be aware of it before you proceed, because acting on a document that is under active legal challenge would expose both you and your principals to significant liability." The deputy stared at him. Jonas held his gaze. He was aware of Runs Clear standing very still behind him. He was aware of the man with the unlit torch. He was aware of the weight of the badge on his chest, and the weight of the rifle in his hands, and the weight of 6 years of mornings. The deputy said, "You're making a lot of trouble for yourself, Redfern." Jonas said, "I'm doing my job." Another silence. The creek talked to itself in the background. Then the deputy folded the document and put it back in his coat. He said he would be in contact with the county office. He said this was not over. Jonas said, "It isn't, but tonight it is. I suggest you ride back to Harmon." The 3 men left. Jonas stood at the edge of the camp and watched until the sound of their horses faded completely. Then he turned around. Runs Clear was still standing exactly where she had been. Behind her, the entrance to Grandfather Cedar's shelter was open. The old man was visible in the dim light inside, watching. The 2 children, a boy of about 8 and a girl of about 6, were pressed against their grandmother's side, looking at Jonas with the particular expression of children who have been still and quiet for as long as they can manage and are now uncertain what happens next. Jonas knelt down to their level. He said, in Lakota, "Sleep now. You're safe tonight." The boy looked at him with his mother's eyes. "Are you a sheriff or a Lakota?" he asked. It was such an honest question, asked with such complete simplicity, that Jonas stayed on his knees for a moment longer than he'd meant to. He said, "I'm both. Those things don't subtract from each other." The boy thought about this with the seriousness that children apply to important information. Then he went inside. What happened over the next 2 weeks was, by the standards of Callow Creek, remarkable. It was remarkable not because of any single dramatic event. There was no shootout, there was no fire. The land agents did not return with additional men, though Jonas had prepared for this possibility. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to explain. It started with Edna Marsh. Edna was 63 years old and had lived in Callow Creek her entire life. She had watched Jonas wear a badge for 6 years with the general attitude of someone who had accepted a situation they hadn't chosen. She had never spoken against him, but she had never spoken particularly for him either. She was simply one of the 300 people who constituted the ambient population of his life. The morning after Jonas stood at the edge of the camp and sent 3 men back to Harmon, Edna Marsh came to the jail office. She brought 2 things: a letter she had received from the land company and a pan of cornbread. She set the cornbread on his desk. She said, "I heard what you did last night. I heard it from Dora Finn, who heard it from the Pierce boy who was night fishing downstream. Jonas said Callow Creek moved fast. Edna said it always had. She said, I want you to know something, Jonas Redfern. I voted against your appointment 6 years ago, not because of who you are, because I thought a young man with no experience would get himself killed inside of a year and leave us worse off than before. She looked at him directly. I was wrong about the experience part, she said. You got more of that than most men twice your age, she said. Don't thank me yet. Briggs is going to make trouble, and the county isn't finished. He told her he knew. She said, well, you know where I live if you need a witness to anything. She left. Jonas looked at the cornbread. It was the 7th congratulation he had received in 6 years. The legal situation resolved over the following week in the particular way that careful documentation tends to resolve things. Carver, the lawyer in Benton Falls, had indeed received Jonas's materials and had filed a formal challenge on the basis of the witness irregularity. The challenge triggered a review that suspended the land company's ability to act on the filing until the review was complete. Reviews took time. Time, in a territory where the railroad speculation was moving quickly, was expensive. The Harmon Land Consortium had several other projects competing for their attention. The cost-benefit calculation of pursuing a contested filing in a small creek settlement against an organized legal challenge with the accompanying public exposure was not favorable. They withdrew the filing. This was not announced dramatically. There was no confrontation, no official statement. A letter arrived at the county office in Harmon. Another letter went to Jonas's office. The filing was withdrawn pending resolution of procedural questions. The land company moved on to other opportunities. The camp remained. Edna Marsh's farm remained. Jonas sat at his desk and read the letter twice. Then he put it in his files, in the careful alphabetical order he had maintained for 6 years. He wrote the date in his journal. He noted the outcome. Then he went about his day. Aldous Briggs took the withdrawal of the land filing personally. This was not surprising. Briggs had invested real money in the consortium. Not a great deal, but enough to matter to his sense of things. More than the money, he had invested something harder to quantify, the expectation that the territory was going to develop in a particular direction, and that men who positioned themselves correctly at the beginning of that development would benefit substantially. Jonas had complicated that expectation. That was, in Briggs's accounting, a personal offense. For 3 weeks after the withdrawal, Briggs did nothing specific. He spoke poorly of Jonas in the saloon, which was not new behavior. He lobbied 2 of the 5 town council members to revisit the question of the sheriff's appointment, which was also not new behavior. He received the same response he had always received. The county had confirmed the appointment, and nobody in Callow Creek wanted to be the person who took the badge from Jonas Redfern and then had to explain to the county why they had done so. The specific trouble came on a Saturday night. A man named Curly Watts, who had worked for Briggs in various capacities for several years and who was known to Jonas as someone who did things when asked, came into the jail office and told Jonas there was a fight at the saloon. This was not unusual. Saturday nights produced fights with some regularity. Jonas went. What he found was not a fight. What he found was Curly Watts's version of a message. There were 4 men, all of them Briggses, all of them known to Jonas, positioned around the saloon in a configuration that was not accidental. They had not done anything yet. They were simply present, in that way that certain kinds of men are present when they are waiting for a response. Jonas stood in the doorway. He looked at the four men. He looked at Briggs, who was behind the bar with the expression of someone watching an experiment. Then he looked at the room itself, the 30-odd Saturday night regulars who had gone very quiet. He said, in the same even voice he used for everything, "Curly, I was told there was a fight." Jonas said, "Then I'll head back. You know where to find me if something actually happens." He turned and walked out. He heard the noise resume behind him. He walked 3 doors down the street to the trading post, which was closed but had a lit lamp in the back because Ferris, the land office clerk, was known to sit there in the evenings reading. He knocked. Ferris opened the door with his usual look of mild surprise at being disturbed. Jonas said, "I need you to do something for me." Ferris said, "All right. I need you to go to your office tomorrow morning and pull every land record associated with the Briggs property on the north side of town, the saloon and the building next to it. And I need you to tell me when those properties were originally filed and who the original owners were before Briggs." Ferris looked at him carefully. "You think he has a title problem?" "I think he might," Jonas said. "The same kind of witness irregularity problem that the consortium had, and I think that's worth knowing." Ferris was quiet for a moment. "Jonas," he said, and it was the first time in their entire acquaintance that Ferris had used his first name. "If I find something, you know what that means. You know what he'll do." Jonas said, "I know. He'll come after your appointment. Hard. He's been doing that for 6 years. Ferris looked at him with the expression of someone who was making a decision about what kind of person he was. He said, "I'll look in the morning." Jonas went home. He sat by the small stove in his room behind the jail office. He thought about the night ahead, and the night after it, and the particular shape of a life that has been built in the narrow space between 2 fires. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was, in the way that his mother's cousin's oldest word described, still. He was still water. He went to sleep. Ferris found the irregularity. It was there, in the original filing for the saloon property, 17 years back. A witness signature, a different name than the one on the consortium's documents, but the same handwriting. Jonas had the consortium documents in his files, and he compared them carefully, because he was the kind of man who compared things carefully. The same hand had witnessed both filings. Whatever relationship existed between Briggs and the consortium, it was older than anyone in Callow Creek had known. They had been working the same territory with the same methods for at least 17 years. Jonas sat with this information for a full day. He thought about what Grandfather Cedar had said, about the test that looks like it's about land and law, but is really about what a man does when the choosing costs him everything he has built. Here was the choosing. He could use this information against Briggs directly. He could bring it to the county, create a formal challenge to Briggs's property claim, begin the same process that had successfully unwound the consortium's filing. It would be legitimate. It would be legal. It would almost certainly result in significant chaos. For Briggs, for the town council, for Jonas's own appointment, which Briggs would fight with everything he had. Or he could hold it, not use it offensively, keep it, let it be what it was. Insurance, in the same way that documentation always becomes insurance. Let Briggs know, quietly, that Jonas knew. Let the knowledge of what Jonas knew be the thing that ended the offensive. He thought about Runs Clear. He thought about Edna Marsh. He thought about the 30-odd Saturday night regulars who had gone quiet in a saloon when 4 men positioned themselves and waited for a response that never came. He thought about 6 years of mornings. Then he put on his hat and walked to the saloon. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slow, the kind of quiet that Callow Creek had on days when nothing was scheduled to happen. Briggs was behind the bar wiping a glass and looked up when Jonas came in. Jonas sat on a stool at the far end of the bar. He placed his hat on the bar in front of him. He said, "I want to show you something." He laid the original filing document for the saloon property on the bar. Next to it, he laid the consortium filing with the matching witness signature. He said, "I'm not going to the county with this today. I'm not going to the county with it tomorrow. I have it. I know what it means. And now you know that I know." Briggs stared at the 2 documents. His face did several things. Jonas watched it without expression. "What do you want?" Briggs finally said. Jonas said, "I want the same thing I've wanted for 6 years, for this town to work the way it's supposed to, for the law to apply equally, for no one to show up at anyone's camp with an unlit torch." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Jonas said, "I'm not your enemy, Aldous. I never was. I'm the law. I've been the law since the first morning I pinned on this badge, and I'll be the law the morning after this conversation, and the morning after that. That doesn't change." He picked up his hat. He stood up. "But I want you to hear this clearly," he said. "The next time someone with a connection to you shows up at that camp with a torch, lit or unlit, I will use everything I have. Everything. And I have enough." He put his hat on his head. He walked out. He heard Briggs say his name behind him. Not sheriff, not with the invisible quotation marks that had been there for 6 years. Redfern. Jonas stopped. He did not turn around. Briggs said, "Your father was a good man. I heard that before my time." "Yes," he said. He walked out into the afternoon sun. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed Jonas walking out of that saloon on a Tuesday afternoon. He felt it as he crossed the street. He felt it in the specific way the afternoon sun came down on the dust of Main Street, in the way the ordinary sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer 2 doors down, the creak of a wagon wheel on the far end, a dog somewhere giving its opinion about something, reassembled themselves around him. He had done something he had not been entirely certain he was going to do until he did it. He had shown Briggs his hand, not to destroy him. He had the means for that, and he had chosen not to use them that way. He had shown him his hand to stop a motion that had been in progress for 17 years without anyone naming it clearly. Naming a thing changed its nature. That was something Jonas had observed over 11 years of moving between 2 worlds that did not acknowledge each other. The unnamed thing had power precisely because it was unnamed. Put a name on it. Put documentation on it. Put a date and a signature and a cross-referenced witness record. And the power diminished. Not always completely, not always quickly, but it diminished. He thought about what Briggs had said as he left. Your father was a good man. He had thought about his father in pieces over the years, in the way you think about someone you never fully knew, assembling the portrait from other people's descriptions, from the 3 things left behind. He had thought about the fairness that the town's memory attributed to Thomas Redfern, the way certain reputations survive a man's death because they were built on something real enough to outlast the building. He wondered what his father would have made of that Tuesday afternoon. He thought his father would have understood it, not because Thomas Redfern had ever navigated exactly the same landscape. He had not, could not have, was himself a man of one world looking at another, but because a man who put on a badge and tried to apply it evenly understood something essential about the cost of that consistency. It was always going to offend someone. It was always going to put you sideways with someone who wanted the badge to bend their direction. The only question was whether you bent it. Thomas Redfern, as far as Jonas could tell from everything he had inherited, had not bent it. Neither had Jonas. He went back to the jail office. He sat at his desk. He opened his journal to a fresh page and wrote the date and a brief account of what had happened. He wrote, "Showed Briggs the witness match. He understood. No formal action taken. This may hold. Document everything." He underlined the last part. He always underlined the last part. It was the only instruction he had ever given himself that applied equally to everything. He thought about Runs Clear's camp. He thought about Grandfather Cedar saying things that were small and enormous at the same time. He thought about Thomas, the boy named for his father, standing at the edge of the boundary watching him cross without stopping. The line is in other people's heads, not in the land. He had said that to a 9-year-old boy, and he had meant it for himself as much as for the child. He had been saying some version of it to himself for 31 years. But something about saying it out loud, in the morning light, to someone who was still early enough in life to build their understanding of the world around it. Something about that had made it feel more settled inside him than it had before. He was, as Grandfather Cedar had once said, still water. He closed the journal. He made a pot of coffee on the small stove. He drank it slowly, watching the late afternoon light come through the one window in his room. In the months after, Callow Creek did what small towns always do. It kept going. The land company from Harmon moved their attention south, toward the railroad route, where the development money was more dependably fertile. The county seat in Harmon sent Jonas a formal letter acknowledging his handling of the filing challenge. A dry, official letter that said nothing personal, but said it in a way that suggested awareness. Carver, the lawyer in Benton Falls, sent a short note that simply read, "Good work. Keep those records." Jonas kept them. Briggs was still in Callow Creek. He was still at the bar every afternoon and most evenings. He still had opinions and still expressed them. But the nature of the opinions shifted incrementally over time. He stopped saying certain things in certain company. He did not endorse Jonas's work, but he stopped working actively against it. In the narrow political geography of Callow Creek, this constituted something like peace. Ferris, the land office clerk, became what Jonas might, if pressed, have described as a friend. They did not socialize in any conventional sense, but Ferris left his lamp burning late several evenings a week, and Jonas stopped by occasionally, and they talked about things: land records, territorial law, the general shape of the world as it was changing. Edna Marsh brought cornbread twice more that year. She stopped explaining why. Jonas kept riding the 3 miles east on Wednesday mornings. Runs Clear made tea. Grandfather Cedar sat at the entrance to his shelter and said little, and understood much. The children grew. The boy who had asked whether Jonas was a sheriff or a Lakota was named Thomas, after Jonas's father. A coincidence runs clear had arranged deliberately but never mentioned, because she believed some things communicate better as facts than as explanations. Thomas, at age 9, developed a habit of following Jonas to the edge of the camp when he left on Wednesday mornings. He would stand at the boundary line, the invisible but understood edge between the camp's territory and the trail, and watch Jonas ride away. One morning, Jonas stopped and looked back. The boy was standing at the boundary, watching. Jonas said, "What are you waiting for?" "I'm trying to see what you do at the line." Jonas said, "What do you mean?" "Where you cross from here to there," Thomas said. "You go from this side to that side. I'm trying to see how you do it without stopping." Jonas looked at him for a moment. He said, "You just keep riding. The line is in other people's heads, not in the land. The land doesn't know about it." Thomas considered this. "Does it feel different on the other side?" Jonas said, "Sometimes. It gets quieter inside." The boy nodded with the seriousness of someone receiving important information. "I think I can do that," he said. Jonas said, "I know you can." He rode back to Callow Creek. The badge was on his chest. The sun was still low in the east, coming at a long angle over the flat land, turning the dust on the trail copper and gold. The creek was talking to itself somewhere to the south. He thought about mornings, 6 years of them and counting. He thought about his mother, Morning Sparrow, who had made biscuits for a deputy who stayed a winter and became a life. He thought about Jonas Redfern, who had left 3 things behind: a name, a reputation for fairness, and a boy who looked like he belonged to 2 different stories at once. He thought about what Grandfather Cedar had told him. Stillwater moves when it must, not before. He had moved when it mattered. He had held when holding was right. He was still here. He rode into Callow Creek on a Wednesday morning, the same as every other morning, and pinned on his badge and went about his day. He was the sheriff of Callow Creek. He had always been the sheriff of Callow Creek. Not half a sheriff, not a temporary arrangement, not a placeholder for something better. He was the whole things. Stillwater, Jonas Redfern, the man in the middle who had learned, one morning at a time, that the middle was not a place of weakness. It was the only place from which you could see clearly in every direction. And that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now. Jonas Redfern never became famous. There are no ballads about him, no dime novels, no statues in any town square. He wore a badge for 11 more years after that Tuesday afternoon in the saloon, and he wore it the same way he always had, with the same patience, the same consistency, the same willingness to stand in the middle of a road and hold his ground. He died at the age of 61, in the room behind the jail office where he had slept for 17 years. Runs Clear was there. Thomas, the boy who had watched him cross the invisible line, was there, grown now, a man of 29 who had made something of himself in ways that would have made 2 different families proud. They buried him between the town and the creek, at the halfway point on the trail he had ridden 10,000 Wednesday mornings. The headstone said Jonas Redfern, Sheriff. Just the one title, just the one word. He would have liked that, I think. Some men spend their whole lives trying to prove they belong somewhere. Jonas Redfern spent his belonging everywhere at once, carrying both fires inside him so that neither side had to burn alone. That's the kind of man this world runs short of. You rest easy tonight, friend, and if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning same as always. Good night.